of the American Association of University Women. And we're very pleased tonight to present the first program of this year because of all of the things that happened. Usually we have many more programs, but this is a very important one as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So with this, I am going to turn it over to our Vice President of Programs, Yvonne Randolph. And Yvonne is with me here in the room, and we are going to introduce our panelists and get going. A lot to tell.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to have the three women who are going to be talking about the women's suffrage movement tonight. I think for those of you who only know about women's suffrage, it's going to be an interesting, eye-opening adventure listening to these women bring the people who are involved in the women's right to vote to life. So I'd like to introduce them all. When I say your name, can you raise your hand so people will know who I'm talking to? And I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So Estelle, Dr. Estelle Friedman, she's a professor at Stanford. The next person's Wendy, and I think I pronounced your last name Rouse. And last is Nancy Unger.
Where's Wendy from and Nancy from?
Oh, Wendy is from San Jose State, and Nancy's from Santa Clara University. I'm really pleased to have all you guys here tonight. I'm really looking forward to this talk. So I started out by asking each one of you, what excited you, intrigued you about studying about women's suffrage? So I'm going to go and ask you, Estelle.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be talking with other historians and talking to other interested folks about the history of women's suffrage on the cusp of its 100th anniversary of really becoming official law as tomorrow. I think that when I first began studying the history of women, including suffrage, I was struck by the abolitionist origins of the women's suffrage movement in the 19th century. That's something I hadn't learned about, say, in high school or even in college. It was really in graduate school. And it came in part by reading Gerda Lerner's wonderful book, The Grimke Sisters of South Carolina, about these Southern slaveholding white women who rejected slavery, moved north, became part of the anti-slavery movement, and who, like other women at the time, because they wanted to speak out publicly against slavery and were told as women they couldn't do that in their terms, they began to think about their own rights as well as the rights of the enslaved. So that was one thing that always intrigued me, and the experience of somebody like Mariah Stewart, a free Black woman, anti-slavery in the North, again, who tried to speak out in her community against slavery and was told as a woman, you shouldn't be doing this, and then said anybody should be able to speak out, whatever their color, whatever their sex. And you can just see that overlap in the 1830s and 1840s before we even get to Seneca Falls of these sort of interlocking social movements. So that intrigued me from the beginning of my studies.
Thank you. What about you, Wendy?
Well, one of the interesting things that I've been exploring more recently, because I was interested for a while in the history of women's self-defense, and so I wrote a book on that, and that has interesting ties to the suffrage movement, that women at the same time that they're empowering themselves politically are also thinking about their physical empowerment, and this idea that if they don't need to look to men to protect them at the ballot box, they also don't need to look to men to protect them physically. And so this whole self-defense movement kind of emerges out of this. But more recently, my work has been looking at kind of the queer history of the suffrage movement. And I use that term broadly to focus not only on people who, if they were alive today, might identify as LGBTQ+, but also to look at the ways in which suffragists transgressed norms of gender and sexuality in all aspects of their lives. And so it's been really fascinating because I've been able to kind of look at the ways that suffragists created these non-heteronormative domestic arrangements, the ways that they queered death practices and mourning rituals, that they created these chosen families and extended support networks. And so all of these things I think are really fascinating, and I'm still kind of in the middle of this research, so my conclusions are tentative, but I think it builds off of the scholarship that's been out there for the last couple of decades with scholars looking at Boston marriages and the ways that women created these homosocial households, right? That were sometimes romantic friendships, were sometimes romances, that were sometimes just two women sharing a household together or multiple women sharing a household together. I'm also looking at the ways that they transgress like the gender binary through their gender expression. And so hopefully I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but that's some of the things that I'm most interested in right now.
Okay, what about you, Nancy?
Well, first of all, it's really a pleasure to be included in this panel. Like a lot of historians, I had prepared a big illustrated talk to help mark the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, and one by one, those presentations disappeared from my calendar in these days of COVID. So I'm just especially delighted to be here. And just for these introductory remarks, we had up to 5 minutes. So I'd like to share some of my slides with you, and I promise I'll return the screen when I'm done. But I'm just so thrilled to finally have somebody to show this stuff to. So let me see if I can make this work. Okay, so so this was the opener for my formal talk, Winning Women's Suffrage, Celebrating Victories, Learning from Mistakes. And I drew most of that material from my own work on Belle LaFollette, who was a suffragist and a journalist from Wisconsin. And one of the things that really intrigued me about the suffrage movement itself was the very different ways in which it was approached. So certainly there were those who emphasized women's equality with men. Women's cause is man's, this banner says, they rise or fall together. But more intriguing to me was how much the suffrage campaign seemed dominated by women not rejecting their traditional gender roles as wives, mothers, the helpmates, but using those roles to justify their worthiness as voters. So lots of emphasis not on women improving their own lot so much as working to uplift others. We want the vote to stop the white slave traffic, sweated labor, and to save the children. This image is a little more direct. Women's vote will purify the vote of the dirty boy. And these adorable babies certainly serve to blunt the perceived threat proposed by women gaining political power for their own purposes. Women should have the vote so they can be better mothers. It's much less threatening. And this poster blends the two arguments. There's the more feminist reminder that women pay taxes and women obey the laws just like men. But there's also the reminder that women clean the homes, let them clean the city. That perhaps their greatest qualification for the vote is their role as housekeepers. I was also struck by how vehemently and sometimes viciously these stereotypes about women were used to oppose their suffrage. So here, for example, you can see why women should not be allowed to vote because their brains are completely occupied by fashion, babies, and gossip. And here you see how supporting women's suffrage is simply a sign that a woman is frustrated and unnatural. At 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette who's obviously crazed and hideous. So then something else that surprised me was what an important role World War I played in women actually gaining suffrage. President Woodrow Wilson had not been in favor of women's vote until he saw how clearly he needed their support on the home front. He also saw that if women, the sex purported to be more moral and selfless, approved the war, it would reinforce his claims that it was not being waged for power or material gain, but to make the world safe for democracy. So he very specifically called upon Congress to pass the Suffrage Amendment, quote, as a war measure. And so, I mean, certainly decades of women's activism set the stage for women's suffrage, but the war played a key role in actually getting it through Congress. And then finally, what appalled me, it wasn't until relatively recently that I learned how powerful the Southern wall of opposition in the US Congress was in its absolute determination to keep women from voting. White Southerners had been successfully preventing African American men from voting for decades, but the passage of the 19th Amendment would bring new scrutiny to voting practices. And so, well, as it says here, vote against women's suffrage, the third bullet point there, because universal suffrage wipes out the disfranchisement of the Negro by state law. Because of the danger to farmers' families if Negro men vote in addition to 2 million Negro women. And then the final one, vote against women's suffrage because white supremacy must be maintained. Equally appalling was the willingness of many leading white suffrage campaigners to essentially throw their Black sisters under the bus. Even some of my heroes, including Jeanette Rankin, first woman to be elected to the House of Representatives, fell victim to this, reassuring her fellow representatives, there are a lot more white women of voting age in the South today than there are Negro men and women together. So, I mean, there's a lot here to unpack, but those were sort of my original thoughts.
Into that I'm really interested in, but for people who aren't familiar with the suffrage movement, can we just do a brief overview of what I'm calling the two halves, which is before the Civil War, after the Civil War? So Estelle, can you talk a little bit about that period from the 1830s up to the passage of the 15th Amendment?
Sure. The antebellum period I was talking about a little earlier, and the anti-slavery origins of not only the women I was talking about before, but people like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had been at the World Anti-Slavery Conference in London in 1850, where they weren't allowed to be seated as delegates and had to sit in the balcony. Some of their male allies sat with them and talked about doing something about this exclusion of women, and find themselves a few years later, actually it was 1840, excuse me, a few years later, living in upstate New York, near Seneca, and saying, well, we're going to have a conference about women's rights, to which 300 men and women show up in their carriages and start what is considered the beginning of the convention movement in 1848. And so you have these abolitionist anti-slavery origins, and temperance comes in there too. Susan B. Anthony comes to the temperance movement. This sort of social reform, changing society. And then during the sort of period leading up to the Civil War in the 1850s, there's this convention movement where this is when Sojourner Truth, for example, emerges as a member of the suffrage movement, saying, as a Black woman who has been enslaved, I defy these stereotypes that women as a class are on a pedestal. Look what I have had to live through, for example. So you have this overlap in sort of questions of equality of race and gender to some extent. Let me just say, both of those movements are extremely unpopular. They're small, they're radical. This is not the mainstream. But when the Civil War breaks out, the convention movement suspended, and everybody's putting their effort into winning the war and into emancipation. Now, as the other historians know, and probably many people in the audience have probably heard, there is a conflict when it came to the so-called Civil War amendments to the Constitution, particularly the Suffrage Amendment. In the part of the women's movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, wanted the amendment to enfranchise African Americans, formerly enslaved people, and all women. And others, including people like Frederick Douglass, who chaired the Seneca Falls Convention back in 1848, felt this is, quote, the Negro's hour. We need to get Black male suffrage, and then we can think about women's suffrage. And it caused an enormous split in the movement. indeed into two separate suffrage organizations post 1869, the National and the American. And they eventually merged in the 1890s into the National American Women's Suffrage Association. But historians have talked about a shift from that coalition around race and sex, a belief in equal rights, to a much more conservative and conflicted era in the late 19th century, even before the 1890s, where, and Nancy Unger alluded to this, not only around race and sort of white women, particularly Southern white women, but Northern women supporting them too, would say, if uneducated Black men can get the vote, why not educated white women? Or it's not just about African American men, it was about immigrant men who could become naturalized citizens and vote, even if they didn't have the same education as middle class or elite white women. So you see, and it's in the context of a period of hardening lines around race in the post-Reconstruction era, the era known as a period of scientific racism, when these ideas about white supremacy get supported by social Darwinist thinking, of sort of rampant industrial capitalism and beginnings of corporate capitalism, when there's all these class issues as well. Hierarchies are really hardening in the society. And a lot of these white women suffragists go along with, we want to be in the citizens who vote category as white women we'll go first. We didn't get it with Black men, but Black men were being disenfranchised by the 1880s, by the 1890s, by the 1900s. And in a way, white women sort of missed the point that the suffrage was certainly equally, if not more important to Black women who wanted to fight for their race rights as well as their rights as women. I'll stop there for a moment because there's so much more one can say about both the rhetoric and the language and the racial divide that takes place, that leaves us with, as historians, having to be very careful about, on the one hand, crediting these women with a long struggle politically, but also criticizing them for the exclusions. Not everybody was exclusive. There were Black and white women in suffrage organizations together in the North. But when it came to the national level, they would sort of bow to the Southern white women and say, oh, we won't invite them to the meeting because we don't want to lose you, our Southern white sisters. So there was a lot of double standards going on. And, I kind of would love Nancy to talk more. You alluded to Jeanette Rankin in terms of, here's somebody who is so important in the movement, but, has some of these blinders that we have to acknowledge in the context of racial and racist and nativist thinking at the time.
So we have a question about why it's called suffrage. Nancy, you want to answer that?
Well, I used to know the answer to this question, but suffrage, Estelle, Wendy, help me out here. What is the word suffrage? It comes from, is it the Greek, the Latin?
Actually, I saw this very recently, and I'm trying to remember that, but when we think of to suffer, not in the sense of suffering, but to give someone the space or the right, in this case, it's the right to have a role as a citizen, the right in a democracy to vote. But the common root actually is with suffer, and as I understand it,
to suffer fools gladly, that you
but you give people this space, you give them the right, you give them their voice, and in this case it came to stand for the vote. And I should just say, in the United States, usually the term was suffragist. In England, it was tended to be suffragette, and in the United States, suffragette was often used as a diminutive, like these little lesser voters or would-be voters. So I'm always correcting people to say in the United States, suffragist is really the language we prefer.
So Nancy, you did cover a little bit about what happened after the 15th Amendment? You were talking about the progressive era and the change in what the voting rights for women would mean for society. But at that time, after the 15th Amendment, there were other people who were looking for voting rights too. I noticed that Native Americans were able to get voting rights in 1924. You know, and so how?
Native Americans don't become citizens until 1924. Until 1924, they were wards of the United States.
And so did they have to separate themselves from the rest of the women's voting movement in order to do that?
Well, I mean, basically, they're simply an oppressed class, and as Estelle was suggesting, it's not only African American women who are kind of being thrown under the bus, but a whole variety of immigrant groups, and then in addition to those, also Native Americans. So, I mean, as Estelle said, I thought very well, it's a fine line between admiring and being grateful to these white middle and upper class women who really did bring, women the vote, but it's disappointing and frustrating when you see how very sort of self-serving it was. It was so much of it really was based on class and race, economic class and race. And so, yeah, it wasn't, Native Americans, like I say, men and women aren't even citizens until 1924.
Well, I came across articles talking about, for instance, there was one woman, Mabel Ping-Wong Lee. She was actually at the head of a parade, and she was walking with the suffragists. She wanted the vote, but she, Chinese Exclusion Act. And even the Black women after the 15th Amendment passed and the movement was increasingly marginalizing them. I read an excerpt from Mary Terrell's diary where she held the Silent Sentinels. And so I was wondering how these people's relationships with each other managed to transcend the strategy that would leave them out. And ultimately it seemed like the strategy made them walk away from what the movement initially believed in. How did they manage to work together?
Well, I think often they didn't manage to work together. I mean, I think that there was a sense of, among many white suffragists, there was a sense of, well, this is the expedient thing to do. What we need to do is just get this passed, and we'll then maybe it will trickle down. But there was sort of a sense of, well, it's just going to be easier to get this through if we can beat down that southern wall of opposition and so forth, and this is the way to do it. But as Estelle said, there were certainly other women who were like Belle LaFollette, who's a particular favorite of mine, who is really saying, no, you can't do that in a democracy. And it's really important that we all work together, and this is unconscionable, and is genuinely willing to work together. But I mean, I think one of the things that to me has really been, as I suggested before, that really was impressed upon me in looking more deeply at the suffrage movement was how much it reveals about how deeply ingrained, not just sexism, but racism, ethnocentrism, all of these are unfortunately very much part of the story. And some were able to transcend that. But a shocking number, I think, to us in 2020, were not.
You wrote a book about the children in San Francisco Chinatown from the mid-1850s. And one of the things I found in my research was that there were these test court cases that the Chinese business people put together in order to challenge the Chinese exclusion rules. How is it that these people who are discriminated against, why would they want to become American citizens?
Shall I speak to that?
Sure, go ahead.
Or why don't you go first if you have something?
No, go ahead.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts that in economics has a lot to do with all of these stories. So why the push for Chinese exclusion is a lot about the fear of labor competition. Of course, Chinese workers were brought over to build the railroad, but then we wanted to push them out. So much of the opposition, and right here in San Francisco, for example, in this area, came from the white working men who didn't want to be in competition with what they considered cheaper and possibly large numbers of Chinese workers coming in. The workers want the jobs. They need the money, much of which they're sending back to their homes and families. So both of these are going on. Why do people want to be here and why do they put up with this kind of treatment is that they want an economic foothold. And why do they get resisted is partly people who feel in competition with them. So that's one way I would answer any of these questions about, why the resistance, how people perceive the threat to their interests. Although I think when it comes to race that it often takes on a life of its own beyond the economic interest. And it may have origins there, exploitation of Black labor, for example, but then it becomes associated with race in ways that, for example, why white workers don't want to work next to Blacks because they've been demeaned as workers, as lesser, and they will bring our wages down, or they will stand for impurity or something like that. So all these other meanings get attached to it. There's one other thing I wanted to go back to, though, which had to do with Native American voting and citizenship, as you both pointed out. It doesn't come with 1920. But just remember this longer history, too, in which in certain parts of what becomes the United States, there were very powerful women in certain Native cultures who had more authority than white women did, including right in the area of Seneca Falls. Among the Iroquois and the Seneca nations, women really had a political role that was denied to white women at the time. So it's true that over the 19th century, most Native people become wards of the government and don't have citizenship rights, but in certain cultures, women had authority and power. And I just want us to be very careful about not seeing either Native Americans or African Americans as somehow totally victimized in this history. There are all kinds of ways in which they had authority, agency, including breaking into that suffrage parade when they're excluded and told to be at the back and saying no, and finding the white allies who say, come march with us. We're going to let you in the front of the parade. So it's a complicated story. It's never, there's not all heroes and not all victims.
Well, do you think that Stanton and Anthony understood what people understood if everyone wanted the same thing they wanted? Did they want the vote for uneducated white women or just educated white women like them?
Great question.
There were a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds. I understand there were gay people who contributed to the suffrage movement, as well as, African Americans, the Indians provided, the Native Americans provided, a lot of inspiration. And so I'm wondering if Anthony and Stanton were surrounded by people who had a bigger vision than they did, and they just didn't see that. Is that possible?
I think that everybody came to the movement with their own interests and goals and motivations. And I think that they came to realize over time that they needed to focus on the single issue of getting the amendment passed, especially after 1890, when they really start to focus to narrow that down. Because if you think about it, before that, they were talking about all kinds of issues impacting women's lives, from dress reform to family violence. And I think they started to realize that they were coming apart over some of these issues. For instance, like Dr. Mary Walker, I don't know if you've seen pictures of her, but she was an advocate of dress reform well beyond the point that Stanton and Anthony dropped that issue, because Stanton and Anthony realized that that issue was getting them a lot of media attention that they did not appreciate, that was contributing to the stereotype of suffragists as these mannish women who are going to literally wear the pants and take over the roles in the family. And so they dropped dress reform as an issue, but then you have people like Mary Walker, who is continuing to push that issue well into the late 19th century. She gets arrested several times for wearing pants. They ask her, why do you wear men's clothing? And she says, I don't, I wear my own clothes. And so she's continuing to push for that more radical issue. But I think that those people get marginalized in the movement too. Just as women of color get marginalized in the movement, so do people working on these other issues that are considered more radical. Because I think they're trying to market it and package it in a way that's palatable to the general public. Like, you know, look, we only want the right to vote because it'll make us better wives and mothers, right? And so then you see the maternalist rhetoric, that kind of social housekeeping that Nancy was talking about. You start to see that be more of the emphasis after 1890, especially because they realize that publicity campaign is working to counteract this mannish, man-hating suffragist image that had really dogged them in the 19th century.
Yeah, I remember, Nancy, you mentioned that Belle LaFollette, she had this argument, this big tent view, you said, of how to persuade people to accept voting rights for women. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I'm always happy to talk about Belle LaFollette. I just love her. And to take Wendy's point, she had some brilliant things to say on all kinds of things. She said that, you know, the fact that women can't get into their own dresses is the best argument I've ever heard for why they shouldn't have the vote. It's like, you know, it's ridiculous that we, you know, dress as we do. She says, what custom could be more barbarous than a 10-course dinner? You know, she just says, you know, women's time is being wasted on fashion and all this stupid stuff. But Wendy, you're exactly right. Then she decides that, you know, this it's too distracting. People only want one message, and so she focuses on the vote. And Yvonne, to answer your question, the big tent that I talk about is that she kind of tries to give something for everybody. On the one hand, she gives very feminist arguments. Women should have the vote because this is a democracy, for crying out loud. And she testifies before Congress and talks about this and just some very, you know, commonsensical men and women work together. It's all very, you know, very inclusive, but she knows that's off-putting to and threatening to a lot of people. And so she also couches it in the very traditional terms of women should have the vote so they can be better wives and mothers, so that they can vote for pure food and they can, you know, do the kinds of things that will make the home safer and better. And so, I mean, it seems to me that these arguments are kind of mutually exclusive. You really can't say men and women are equal and, you know, it's ridiculous to emphasize any kind of differences. We are all citizens and so forth. And at the same time be saying, oh, but, you know, women really should have it because of this, their maternalism and so on. But she does. And I think it's one of the things that makes her so successful as a suffrage campaigner is that she you know, she gives something to everybody. So I think that it's you know, sometimes I think, oh my God, is she in one speech, you know, she'll really hit on both of these themes, but again, like it's very inclusive and she doesn't turn off anybody.
I thought that was interesting because she's a contemporary with Alice Paul, and she was such a radical, you know, shame them, you know, get in their face. And yet, you know, we know Alice Paul, but we don't know Belle LaFollette. So
yeah, well, Belle LaFollette has the advantage or disadvantage that her husband is a U.S. senator. And so, you know, when people know the LaFollettes, that's who they tend to know. On the other hand, she strikes me a little bit like Eleanor Roosevelt in that she can go out and say all kinds of things that her husband can't say. You know, she's not worried about getting reelected. And so she's the more radical of the two, at least in her speech and her writing. But being married to a U.S. senator also opens doors for her. It gets her speaking engagements and press coverage that, you know, that I don't think would have happened for, you know, for this woman from Wisconsin. And she's interesting. At first, she finds Alice Paul very off-putting. She thinks that Alice Paul is too strident, and that that picture I showed of the silent sentinels, protesting in front of the White House, she thought that was going to turn off too many people in Congress, and she knows a lot about men in Congress. But as time goes on, she comes to really appreciate and respect Paul more and more when she sees the kind of press coverage that she's getting and the attention that she's getting. But I just finished a biography of Helen Hamilton Gardner by Kimberly Hamlin, and which I just thought was just a great book. And Hamlin is just tearing her hair out because she says Alice Paul and those silent sentinels are turning off all the conservatives in Congress who maybe I've been trying to persuade them, to support women's suffrage, and they see these strident women and they're really turned off by that. So it's interesting, one woman's hero is another one who's ruining the movement. It's really a bizarre thing. Estelle, did you want to chime in? Oh, you're muted.
You finish up, Nancy, and then I'll mention something, follow up. You good? Well, I just wondered if we should step back for folks who aren't as familiar with Alice Paul, and also our use of the term feminist, and just do a little generational analysis of the suffrage movement, which, since we're getting into the 20th century here, is that okay, Yvonne? Okay, just to mention that we were talking about people like Stanton and Anthony, or Lucy Stone, or Frederick Douglass, and all these people they're dying off in the beginning of the 20th century. And the new generation is coming up, and this National American Women's Suffrage Association is now sort of the old conservative guard, if you will. But then this younger generation comes by 1910 or so and brings a kind of new radical life into the movement. And Alice Paul is part of that younger generation, and they're the ones, first of all, she was part of the suffragette movement in England. She was studying in England at the time, and she saw the really radical protests there. And they bring this whole other kind of ideology and tactic, and that's when they start using the word feminism, this word that originated in France in the late 19th century, feminisme, this kind of movement for women. So all that Nancy was describing about the wives and mothers and the maternalism Wendy was talking about, that we, as women, give us the vote to be cleaning up the society, and these younger women like Alice Paul come in and said, no, equal rights. We're as good as men. We should have it because men have it. We should be able to do anything men do. And we split off from the old guard and form our own, what becomes the National Woman's Party, which we can talk more about in this sort of post-suffrage era. But that really creates this tactical and generational conflict. Yeah, they're the ones doing the most radical stuff, and the ones going to jail and going on hunger strikes, being force-fed, all the stuff that happened in England. And they get lots of publicity. And, going back to what you said, Nancy, if it hadn't been for World War I, who knows what would have happened, but they are able to hold Wilson accountable for democracy. Really? What about women and the vote? But that's the younger feminists as opposed to the older, more maternalists in the earlier movement. And we have a lot more we can say about them later, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's just, I have so many questions about all sorts of stuff. I want to give people a sense of all that was happening at the time. For instance, I know around the time of the 14th, 15th Amendment, after emancipation, you have Washington just filled with, emancipated slaves. Essentially a town just inundated with refugees, basically people who had, no education. It was, a terrible time. And you have the disappointment that Anthony and Stanton had about not being able to get the right to vote. And I wonder, because it seemed like they didn't understand the struggle that was going on I wasn't so sure they understood the struggle that was going on in Congress about what do you do with all these refugees here in Washington, and then how do you bring the Southerners back into the United States government? And did they make a mistake when they were trying to get women added to the 15th Amendment? Mm-hmm. Was it because they had never been, I guess, politicians, that they didn't tend to form, I think, working relationships with men? Did they put themselves at a disadvantage to plead their case for the 15th Amendment? What do you think?
Great questions.
Estelle, you look like you're ready to answer. I have some thoughts also, and I'm sure Wendy does as well.
I'm gonna keep mulling over. I want to avoid an either or answer. So let me hear Wendy and Nancy.
Wendy, you want to take a crack at this?
No, go ahead. This isn't my time period.
All right. Well, well, it's not mine either, but that doesn't ever stop me. So I don't know. I mean, I think that, you know, I don't think it's so much that they don't know how to approach men, is that men are not going to talk politics with women. You know, that's an anathema. I don't think it's that the women aren't making, you know, an effort. They're just, you know, not going to be listened to. And I think, you know, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, you know, we don't have the word male in the Constitution until, you know, we get this amendment. She said, if that word male is inserted in the Constitution, it will take us a century at least to get it out. So, you know, they really felt the stakes here were very, very high, and that this was going to firm up, you know, the male, you know, lock on suffrage. So I think they were just, I don't think that they were naive. I think they really saw, you know, that this, it wasn't just that they were a bunch of racists, which, you know, they may have been, but as we keep saying, it's more complex than that. I think they were really concerned about that word male and how it was going to just confirm the, you know, the hold on the vote.
So in answer to, did they make a mistake by wanting the 15th Amendment to include women as well as African-American men or formerly enslaved men? I don't think it was a mistake to aspire to a coalition of suffrage seekers, but it was probably politically impossible to achieve at the time. The women's suffrage movement was very young, very new, very radical, very unpopular. The gender divide, as Nancy I think showed, was so strong. And I think the big mistake was that they aligned themselves, Stanton and Anthony, for example, in the late 1860s, in the ratification issues and the debates of the amendments, with Democrats who were very pro-Southern, anti-Black. And that's the beginning of their sort of making that deal with the devil. And again, not every suffragist would go along with that. But they became so expedient, and they turned out to be wrong politically in who they aligned with. It didn't really help them. So, you know, you have to put yourself in their shoes, as I think Nancy's trying to do, in terms of why they felt we have to stop this. But they were a small, radical, unpopular band who threatened gender disorder at a time when gender ordered society. And did it take longer then to get women's suffrage because of that mistake, as it were, or because of that splitting apart? I think you can't, I just don't think you can blame it all on the African Americans and the suffragist women, because there's this whole society around them that is making it hard for all of them, that is saying, you know, we don't really want any of you to be political. Yes, this amendment passes, we enfranchise Black men, but now let the states take it away, take it away, take it away. So none of them really win. None of them really win. And it's not all their fault. It's also the structures of race and gender at the time that placed so many obstacles on African Americans and all women becoming citizens, becoming full citizens. So I'm trying to give an evaluation of your question. It's a hard question, Yvonne, to say, did they make a mistake? They made lots of mistakes.
And I would add, I mean, you have to really think about what they're up against. And you go back to, Thomas Jefferson, all men are created equal, blah, blah, blah. And then he writes to one of the Schuyler sisters, the tender breasts of ladies were not formed for political convulsion. Women are not, political beings. Or everybody knows that Abigail Adams writes to John Adams, remember the ladies, blah, blah, blah. And many people don't know that he writes back and says, I cannot but laugh.
Mhm.
These are our founding fathers who wrote these beautiful words about democracy and equality and so forth. And, clearly have, no intention of seeing women doing that any more than they did their slaves. So I think that there is such a powerful, male dominance politically, economically, in so many other ways when you really look at what this, as Estelle keeps saying, this very small, very radical group of women was coming up against. I think that, yeah, they made plenty of mistakes, but I think that some of them within the context of their times make a little bit more sense when you really think about what they were up against.
Well, I was wondering, because in that time, it seems that there's an acceptance that equality isn't really an idea that people believe in, that there are just people better than other people. We talk about class. People who should vote should be educated people versus people who are ignorant, things like that. And so I wonder if their vision for women's rights was the vision that we hold now for human rights. Did they believe, like even the abolitionists, did they believe that beyond eliminating slavery, that Blacks should be treated equal to whites and all the other races treated equally, or was their sense of fairness and equality different than what we think now?
There's definitely a different sense of fairness and equality in that era than our idea now, and it's continually evolving, right? If you look at from the founding of the US society, from the Constitution, from the Declaration of Independence, there's this constant redefining of what it means to be an American, what it means to be a citizen, who has the rights of citizenship. So that's always constantly evolving, as with this idea of equality. And we see each group, especially throughout the 19th century, struggling to kind of make their way in that, to identify themselves as worthy of this equality and this freedom. And even today, we're still struggling with these same ideas. So I do think it's a totally different era. And sometimes it's hard for us, as everybody's mentioned, to position ourselves in the shoes of women at that time, who, yes, they're asking for the right to vote, but they're asking for the right to vote in an era when they're still fighting to even have the right to go to school, to have education, they're still trying to get into the professions. They're still being paid less than half of what men are being paid for the same jobs in factories. And so there's so many other things that they're facing when it comes to gender inequality, that the vote seems the most radical of the things that they're asking for in that time. Even though now to us, we might look back and say, that's such a simple thing. They should have given them that. Why was that such a struggle? But you have to kind of contextualize it.
So when I'm thinking about this movement, what am I missing? What should I be? I have all these personalities. I've read all this stuff, but I just get a sense of so much happening. I don't know where to focus. You have people working together who end up achieving different things. I found it amazing that there would be, like, Ida B. Wells, she would tell off Frances Willard, one of the people, and yet she'd help her the next day. So their relationship was obviously close to me. It seemed to me that they understood the importance of achieving women's vote, even if they were excluded. Yeah. And I don't have a sense of that strong bond, that willing to say, okay, I'll help you here, but I have to go my own way. Do you guys have a sense of why this cooperation was occurring during that time?
It's interesting you should use Ida B. Wells and Frances Willard as an example because they were so notoriously at odds with each other. For those who aren't familiar, Frances Willard headed the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest women's organization in the late 19th century. And if this is news to you, temperance was a women's issue because husbands who drank tended to be husbands who abused or husbands who spent the money on something other than their children and their families. And it became a suffragist organization. I mean, Frances Willard was a socialist and a populist and a suffragist. But Ida B. Wells, who really starts the Black Women's Club movement as an anti-lynching movement from her own experiences as a newspaper editor in the South, Ida B. Wells just calls Frances Willard out because Willard is not speaking out against lynching. And Black women are asking these white women leaders in their organizations to support the anti-lynching movement in the very late 19th and early 20th century. And they, yes, they shared the goal of suffrage. That is absolutely true. But they, like other African American women, Ida B. Wells is saying, you can't stop there. You know, you can't just stop at calling for women's suffrage. First of all, Black men got the vote, it got taken away, and they're getting lynched. And if we don't all speak out against the terror against African Americans, I mean, how do we have common ground as a sisterhood or people working together in the suffrage movement? And, you know, Willard hedged. Willard said, well, eventually, maybe it's not such a great thing, but I'm sure that they brought it on themselves, or, you know, buys into the myths of the Black male sexual threat and sort of blames, again, the ignorant Black masses, as opposed to realizing the rise of lynching as a tool of white supremacy and to suppress Black political action. So that's a really interesting choice. There may have been others who got along and cooperated better, and there were other white women in the suffrage movement who did support Ida B. Wells more than Frances Willard did. But in that era, it was not typical to have coalitions. There was a lot more separate organizing. The whole society was being segregated. I mean, Plessy v. Ferguson is 1896, right in the heart of this period. The law of the land is you can have separate but equal. And you had separate but equal WCTU chapters. You know, you had separate everything, particularly in the South, but not only. So it would have been going against a lot of trends at the time to have transcended some of those deep divides. I'm just stop there.
Can I give a shout out to Belle Squire, who was actually a white woman who helped integrate the parade, the suffrage parade, alongside Ida B. Wells. And what's interesting about Squire is that they had this goal, this vision of integrating the suffrage movement, right? And she's an example of someone who is also seeing suffrage as just one step to larger social changes. And she's thinking of integration, and she's thinking of all these racial issues, but she's also thinking about, she makes a statement about the vote just being one part of women's freedom. She says, I'm not married, I don't plan on marrying. And she was arguing that she should have just as much respect as a woman who is married, and that why is she being called the diminutive title of Ms., and she insisted on being called Mrs. Squire, even though she wasn't married, because she said that's an honorific title and that gives me prestige and status in society. So again, like, I think they all come together on this idea of suffrage, but they all also have their own things that they're also trying to achieve, whether it's racial integration and into discrimination again, and into violence and into alcohol abuse and family violence, or Squire talking about the need for companion and loving relationships, or even the right to not get married and to still have power and status in society as women.
I would just add, Yvonne, to your question of, you know, alliances, we do see what the so-called Mink Brigade, these wealthy women who are, trying to help, working class women and support their causes and work together for suffrage. But even those links, they only go so far. And, when working women start talking about more radical movements, some of the, the wealthier women, step back. It's like, well, no, we want to help you, but, not to overthrow the capitalist system or anything else. So I think that there as Estelle is saying, this was not a society that tended to have a whole lot of cross class, cross race, and so forth.
Yeah.
There are certainly examples of it, but it wasn't something that that you see a lot of it during this period.
In fact, Nancy, I don't know what you think, as you're the expert in the progressive era, but would you say that, thinking of like the Women's Trade Union League and some of the other efforts, that the women's movement may have had more cross-class alliances than the society as a whole, even though the women's movement faltered in terms of true cross-race alliance in the later period? But when in terms of the labor movement, that I think that, what do you think?
No, I think that's fair to say. I think that's fair to say. But I mean, I don't think anywhere is it, really, prevalent or powerful. Yeah.
Under the impression that the labor unit and the unions really did make a big push to get things moving, though, when they engaged all those women.
Well, yes and no. I mean, one of the reasons that middle and upper class women were organizing for working women was when unions were not. When unions were not paying attention to them or looking for a living wage that the male breadwinner would get. And feeling that young working women would just go off and get married. And so it was often these white women allies, let's say, who came into the labor movement to support organizing and push on some of the trades the women were in, like the garment industry. And again, this is largely white immigrant women. African-American women could not necessarily even get those kinds of jobs at the time. Could I go back to something I think Wendy brought up a few moments ago that I wanted to bring as context? Because Yvonne, when you were talking about all the different moving parts that were going on here, and you think about the actors, but there's also this deeper context when you talked about fighting for education in the 19th century, and that's the first foot in the door very often in any kind of women's movement, feminist movement. But over the time we're talking about, like from the 1830s and 40s, when there's just beginning to be common schools, and then there's some female academies, but in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, more and more women, not just elite women, but more middle-class women, it's becoming possible for them to get higher education. And there's an image, I think maybe one of your images, Nancy, of the college suffragists, or, that these women are becoming part of what feeds the suffrage movement. So there's a shifting ground from you can only be a wife and mother to women who expect to do some kind of work, either professional work or volunteer work in addition. And the fact that for all this talk of motherhood, women are having fewer and fewer children. So a lot of it's symbolic motherhood, not necessarily the reproductive labor and the sort of caring of family, that women have more education, more time to be active, more time to enter careers. It's a long, slow process. But we're talking about a different world by the early 20th century and the first third of the 20th century even, than that early suffrage movement, when there's not a big pool of women who aren't working their fingers to the bone, having all these children, taking care of their families, and who can go out and even work for suffrage, let alone vote. It's another world by the early 20th century.
Actually, this is a good time to mention your research, Wendy, on. It surprised me that there were these women who took it upon themselves that they would actually go and fight back against these people called mashers. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and it's funny because Estelle, some of this research came from reading about your research on mashers as well, I remember. Yeah, so in the early 20th century, right, there's this campaign for the vote that's getting a lot more publicity and attention, and women are thinking about empowerment of their political empowerment, but there's also this physical empowerment movement that is sometimes made up of suffragists, but not always. I mean, there are women who are not suffragists even that are just talking about that they want the a right and ability to walk down the street without being harassed. And some of these are working class women who are just trying to live their daily lives, get to work, not face sexual harassment in the workplace, right? But they're afraid to really speak out about this because there's so many challenges and risks, and especially for women of color, you know, contacting the police and trying to call attention to this issue is very dangerous for them. And so this self-defense movement kind of emerges, I call it the hashtag #MeToo movement of the early 20th century. And it emerges with women anonymously kind of writing into newspaper columnists who, at that time, there were these more women journalists who are writing columns in magazines and newspapers. So they write in anonymously and they talk about this problem of the masher and that how they are facing harassment on the street and in their workplace, and that something needs to be done about this. And it ends up creating this whole like story that takes off in the media about the masher, and it kind of becomes a sensationalist story that's blown out of proportion really to the statistics of the issue. But it does raise the issue of sexual assault, violence against women, harassment in the workplace, and it does power this, what I call the first self-defense movement, which is women signing up for boxing and jujitsu lessons, in part because they're either experiencing this violence and harassment themselves, or they're hearing about it and they're afraid and they want to do something to prepare and protect and defend themselves. And this coincides with an athletic movement at this time where more and more Americans in general are trying to focus on getting in shape and getting healthy. And all these college educated women we just talked about took classes in college on physical fitness. And so the idea of them taking boxing lessons or jujitsu lessons isn't that far out of the norm at this time. But it is pretty radical because women were still being told to be careful the types of exercise that they engage in, that it could be dangerous to their bodies, to their reproductive abilities. So these women that take up boxing and jujitsu are kind of this wave of new women, feminists, suffragists in some senses, even if they're not technically out there on the battlefield fighting for suffrage, they are representing this more politically, physically empowered woman.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And then I should add that there's actual suffragists fighting police in England and in Britain, and the British suffragists faced so much police brutality that they realized that they had to do something to actually prepare to protect and defend themselves. So they began training in jiu-jitsu, and they actually had a secret bodyguard of women that were trained in jiu-jitsu to protect the leaders when the police came to arrest them, that they would try to surround them and help them escape. So there was literally suffragists who were engaging in jiu-jitsu for the purpose of protecting and defending themselves in the fight for the vote.
That's good to hear. Women kicking butt.
Yeah. And there's photos of it and stuff too, so it's really cool.
You don't have that photo with you, do you?
I'll find it.
I saw some ads. They were funny. So there's some questions. One person here wrote, "I'm always troubled by the slant that looks for fault with the suffragists, that they made mistakes with how they approach politicians. I think the insidious enemy has always been and will be white supremacy and entrenched male supremacy. If those two strains are always the norm, then those who are trying to overcome them always appear to be wrong." You know, that's a good point, because male supremacy, white supremacy, why would you want to give up your privilege? Isn't that the problem that we all, face when we're trying to change social norms? People believe that someone, if you're on top, somebody has to be on the bottom by definition. And I think that was one of the things that the suffragists worked hard to overcome.
Well, I think they, I thought that comment was well put. And I also think, it's not, these aren't just sort of widely believed things. I mean, one of the things I have my students look at are, medical books from this time that, that make it very clear that women's little pea brains, cannot handle higher education. They'll become sterile because it will, suck up all of their reproductive juices. That, we have the medical profession, we have ministers speaking every Sunday about women as the weaker sex, the the male is preferred by God as the God-given head of the family. I mean, there are such overwhelming reinforcements throughout society at so many levels. Again, it's not just kind of undercurrent or sort of dog whistly stuff. It's it's mandated, it's the law, it's what doctors, ministers, what everybody is telling you. So it's really, really entrenched.
Yeah, I think this comment goes back well to when we were talking about mistakes and not blaming the suffragists entirely and looking at the context in which they had to operate. And it also, that point I made before about the balancing act we have as historians, which is to acknowledge that context and also hold people responsible when sometimes they should have known better, or when other women were saying, we should do this differently. So that brings me back to like Alice Paul and that younger generation the radicals who really helped revitalize the suffrage movement. But once suffrage is ratified and becomes the law of the land, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association becomes the League of Women Voters, and it's going to train the new voters, Alice Paul and her group become the National Women's Party and introduce the Equal Rights Amendment into Congress. This is in the early 1920s. And when both Union women or African American women go to the National Women's Party conference in the early 20s and say, the battle, we have all these other things, we got the suffrage, now let's work on workers, and let's work on the rights, and what about getting Black women to be able to vote as well? And Alice Paul says, no, those aren't women's issues. Those are workers' issues, those are race issues. The Equal Rights Amendment will solve everything. She should have known better. Lots of other women like Florence Kelley or Mary Church Terrell, or all these women around who disagreed with her. At that point, she should have known better. But I think that her National Women's Party became the small band of feminists in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and they were not taken very seriously because they did not build coalitions. And they were seen as in opposition to all these other social movements. So yeah, it was a hard time to be a feminist, partly because feminists were seen as so narrowly self-interested.
So of all these different people and personalities, who do you admire the most? Could be several people. Actually, I admired Susan Anthony because she was so focused and she went out to change something and had no idea how tall the mountain was going to be and how long it was going to take. I really do think that she's the appropriate symbol because she persisted, and I see that saying all over, she persisted, but it's hard to do that, and I think that the fact that she died without ever achieving what her goal was the saddest thing. But I think that she also was the inspiration. If there's something that's worth having, you go at it for as long as it takes, and hope other people take up the torch.
In some of my more recent research too, I've had the chance to read some of the letters and diaries of some of the women, especially the radical National Women's Party suffragists who are facing arrest, imprisonment, and hunger strikes. And sometimes what surprises me is that we forget the personal cost of some of their choices. So I literally will read their letters and diaries and sense the tension that their actions are creating with their own families. So some women end up divorced through their efforts to fight for the vote. Some women end up getting into major arguments with their parents, with their mother, over the fact that they're going to jail and ruining their status or not getting married and getting a job. And I think sometimes we forget too, and this goes back to your point about Anthony, is that they are so radical for their time that they're even outside their own family's norms. And so it's kind of, to me, that's inspiring. So I wouldn't pick any one person to say inspires me. I think it's just the personal sacrifices that they made in this movement that often cost them relationships, even as it gained them new relationships, intense friendships, sometimes romances with other suffragists, sometimes new marriages with male suffragists, right? So there's all these interesting relationships dynamics. And I think today too, when we're talking about the divisiveness of politics, and how it sometimes feels like civil war in our own families, that is what the suffragists are facing at that time as well.
Unmute. I'm going to mention Harriet Stanton Blatch as someone people may not know, but is worth knowing, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who wound up in England during that radical suffrage movement and then coming back to the United States, and is one of those people who organizes working women and does try to hold other issues together during the progressive era. And I won't say more about her, but to think about the continuity, think about having to live up to the reputation of that mother and yet going on and seeing the struggle to the end. Susan B. Anthony wasn't married, didn't have children to see that later, but Harriet Stanton Blatch is someone I think people should know more about.
And I, of course, have to keep, banging the drum for Belle LaFollette. And I love her because she is involved in so many things. I mean, she's probably best known for her suffrage work, but and because she was a journalist, she left so many wonderful articles. You can really read what she had to say. But in 1913, when Woodrow Wilson is busily racially segregating Washington, D.C., she'd been kind of picking at the edges of racism, and she just goes ballistic over this and really gives some profound speeches. And in the Black community, she's hailed as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of the generation, and gets it's really impressive to me. And she gets hate mail. She's called a disgrace to the white race, and she just perseveres. And I also am amazed because they were not a well-to-do family. They're living on his salary as a U.S. senator, and they're raising 4 children, and she's, doing, all kinds of stuff without, the massive funding that a lot of these women were pretty well to do. But I'm really taken by her because, after suffrage, she continues to fight for racial equality. She's a pacifist. She gets very involved in before and during World War I, and then after the war, trying to stop the buildup of armaments. And I mean, it's just amazing to me to see somebody, all of these are of just one piece to her. How can we make society better? And this is our obligation to do it. What I don't like about her, and what I don't like about a lot of these women, is there's not a one of them that I want to go have a beer with. They seem so humorless. And maybe that's just the price that you pay, in this such an oppressive society. But, and even her family says, for God's sake, mother, lighten up, just for 5 minutes. But she can't, because there are all these problems in the world, and she feels it's her obligation that she has to do what she can. So it's really admirable, but it's also just exhausting. That's one of the things that really, I think we're all sort of suggesting this, that these women are They are very hardworking, and they just never seem to let up, which is why they are able to achieve things despite all these amazing odds. But, you know, God, it's just, you know, it makes me tired.
On the question of humorless, are you familiar with the cartoonist, the suffrage cartoonist? I believe her name was Lou Rogers. Wendy, have you come across her at all? But she did a lot of the images that we've seen and used in our classes, but there's a little sense of humor in there sometimes, as well as sense of outrage. So I recommend those. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be a welcome. I'll take a look, because they're, yeah, it's, I mean, there's some there, but like I said, Belle LaFollette in particular, it's just like, oh my God, you know, just once, just a little moment. But she, you know, life is too serious, and she's got to keep at it.
You know, I tried very hard to find a photo or a picture or something of Susan B. Anthony where she wasn't looking so grim at the camera. And I never found one. I just, you know, I assume she had a sense of humor. I did read a few contemporary newspaper articles about her where they mentioned how grim and humorless. They made a big deal of the fact that she seemed so unattractive to them, you know?
Well, I think some of that is, you know, you didn't want to appear frivolous. Or, you know, I mean, you wanted to be taken seriously, and so you tended to look serious. You know, and I think it was bad enough they had to wear all that, you know, those clothes that so branded you as, you know, as a woman. So I think some of that was calculated. Well, also, you didn't have snapshots at that time. You had to be sitting still, you know, for a portrait. But I think some of it was really calculated to say, we are serious, you know, take us seriously.
Ask about communication. How did these women communicate with each other? I mean, these are letters going by U.S. Post Office, keeping them all together. That's just fascinating.
And telegrams. There's a lot of telegrams too, especially during the time of the imprisonment of a lot of the suffragists during the Silent Sentinel campaign. And I find the telegrams really interesting. Hazel Hunkins sent a telegram to her mother saying, "I'm going to jail with some of the finest women in America. So see you soon." It's just funny reading the telegrams.
So you didn't get the mom's telegram back, like?
Oh, I've read the mom's letters back. She's not happy. Yeah, that's an interesting mother-daughter relationship. Her mom keeps kind of pushing her. Well, her mom's concerned about the reputation, right? Because she's hearing all about her daughter's actions throughout through the newspapers in the small town, and she's like, "You're ruining your reputation." Eventually, she seems to kind of get over that, but she never seems to get over the fact that she wants her to settle down, get married, have a job closer to home, and Hazel Hunkins keeps pushing back on that, saying, "I'm having the best time of my life. I'm meeting so many wonderful people. I'm learning so much, and I'm never going to have this chance again." And so she really delays marriage as long as she can.
You do have a question about what's one book that I should read about the women's suffrage movement from the 19th century to today. So it goes back to that message of what happened after it happened, and where do we learn about that? Estelle, when
I don't know if there's one book that comes up to today, but there's been a number of books published very recently. And the one that I'm going to mention is Martha Jones, historian named Martha Jones, which is largely about African-American women and political authority and suffrage. And I'm also, if you don't mind, going to plug a book of mine because, 20 years ago, one of my esteemed colleagues, Tara Vanderveer, the women's basketball coach, said to me, "Is there one book I could read about the history of feminism, the stuff you teach?" And I said, I can't think of one, and so I'll have to write it. So I turned my lectures into a book called No Turning Back, The History of Feminism and the Future of Women. And I recommend it, No Turning Back, for not just US history, but around the world, women's movements from well earlier than the 19th century all the way through the beginning of the 21st century, at least to the end of the 20th century.
And I would second that nomination. I think that's a fantastic, that really is, it's a fantastic book. I think that'd be the one that I would recommend.
Yeah.
And I would third that nomination, and I would say that everybody reads that as, right, in their in their feminist history classes. So thank you, Estelle, for that. And also, everything that's been written, there's been a lot of books written this year, 2020, for the centennial, and amazing scholarship by amazing scholars doing work on suffrage history and rewriting the narrative that really challenges everything up to this point as well. So Vanguard by Martha Jones, that's the book I think you're referring to. And there are we'll send a list out if you'd like of all the books that came out this year, but they're fantastic, including looking at a variety of different groups that were fighting for the right to vote in their own ways, and even beyond the 19th Amendment.
There's also a friend of mine, Susan, is it Goodwin? Such a good friend, I've forgotten her last name, wrote a really good book on women opposed to suffrage. And it's really interesting to read, these women's perspective and why they felt this was wrong for women, and then what happens when women get the vote, and we see that they do exercise it because they feel that they must, as women, to vote, for the right things. But I think the opposition is pretty interesting as well.
On that issue of exercising the vote, there's something I always try to impress upon my students when we talk about the suffrage movement. It goes to these longer stories. Again, women didn't start just voting the day after or the year after. It took an entire generation before women voted in the same proportion as men voted. I think it was in the 1950s. And then it took another generation of women voting in the same proportion as men before the gender gap emerged by the 80s and certainly by the 90s. And as we can see today, certainly in presidential politics, we have a very clear gender gap. In the early 1920s, the League of Women Voters was real, and the parties were organizing schools for how do you vote? How do you become civically engaged? It wasn't something a lot of women had experience with. Many women voted the same way their husbands did for a long time, and that has changed. And women vote independently. They vote, and then African American women, yes, they were unable to vote in the South, but where they were able to vote in the country, outvoted white women. That is, they voted in higher numbers than white women did as soon as they got suffrage whenever they could. And we can see again today this continuity of how important Black women's votes are in American politics.
Tell me what happened with Alice Paul, because she sort of drops out of the narrative after, the 19th Amendment.
No.
Yeah, I don't know what she did.
Well, as Estelle said, she's the one who really sort of takes over the narrative and says the ERA is the solution to all problems. And Belle LaFollette is watching her at a conference, just saying, what happened to divorce rights? What happened to working women's rights? What's happened to, and Alice Paul is like, no, it's just all about the ERA. And she bangs that drum and really sort of has the whole spotlight and keeps a lot of women marginalized for a very long time. And plus she lives to be 1,000 years old, and she's still very outspoken. And she lives to, I believe she's in her 90s when she dies. No, she hangs on for a long time. And she, as Estelle says, she's not listening to anybody else. She knows the Equal Rights Amendment is the answer to all things, and that's all there is to it, and is actively working against all kinds of other things that women are trying to do that are gonna protect women and promote their interests. And she's just not having it. So she's intractable. She was apparently
very charismatic. And so people who got bound up with her as her acolytes or her followers stayed really loyal. So there's this small band, and there's a number of very wealthy women who fund the National Women's Party, which is how it can survive through all these decades, even though it's so small and unpopular. So there's, people who just go through their life as young women in the teens and the 20s and continue to be part of her push for the ERA. And I'll be really curious, Wendy and Nancy, how you teach this, but lo and behold, those little old ladies in tennis shoes from the National Women's Party, who have been pounding the pavement of Congress all those decades about the Equal Rights Amendment, and even get on the party platform in the 40s and get it through Congress, begin to get it heard by Congress after the war. They are there in the 1960s when the Civil Rights Act is being debated in Congress. And they are going into Southern segregationist Howard Smith senator's office and saying, like, you need to put women in here, not just blacks. And it's part of the reason that we have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is why we get the EOC and why we get NOW and why we get liberal feminism. So there's this continuity between the National Women's Party lobbyists in Washington all these years. So they had cultivated him for years. And they deserve some credit for keeping the equal rights flame alive when, you know, the labor movement, Eleanor Roosevelt, social justice, women reformers did not want to be associated with feminism because that was the National Women's Party's single issue. But they were there when things began to turn and liberal feminism came of age, and then they begin to die off. So yes, very curious if that's the way you teach it or if you have a different opinion of their role.
So that's a question. That's how do they teach it?
Yeah, so how would you teach about this movement to like a elementary school sixth grader? You don't have to teach all of it, but how could you present the subject?
Well, there's a reason that I chose to be a university professor, and that's because I can't imagine teaching kids. Occasionally, my son is a teacher, and I'll go give a guest lecture in his classes, and it just terrifies me. I want to be in a room where people want to be there. They've signed up to take my class. I don't know how anybody is a teacher in the lower grades. I find it very, very intimidating. And I think it's a lot of it is because I have given presentations to teachers on how they can incorporate women's history or LGBTQ history in their classes. But what's so daunting to me is they have a list as long as your arm of all of these things they have to cover. And it's just for the various testing and the state requirements and so forth. And it's just very, I would find that very frustrating to deal with that. So I consider it my job to say, okay, here's how you can do double duty. You know, you can do women's history while you're covering, you know, these various aspects of what you have to do. But I think there's a reason that so many people don't like history. And I think so much of it has to do with the way that that it's not the way that the teachers teach it. It's the way the teachers are required to teach it, or the kind of stuff that they're required to cover. So that's kind of a rant that doesn't really answer your question, but at the foundation of it, that's my response.
I teach in the teacher education program, and I would similarly rant along with you because as I look at the standards and I look at the framework for teaching K-12 social science history, there's very little women's history in there, actually. There's quite a bit of ethnic history. There's quite a bit of social history. There's quite a bit of history of politics, right? Civic action, but there's not a ton of specific focus on women's history. And most educators I know don't even cover the suffrage movement itself. And that's unfortunate. So for many of us in the teacher preparation programs, we're just trying to get them to cover suffrage, just cover that, at least cover suffrage, right? At least cover Seneca Falls. And I know that there's this big, larger debate among historians about, you know, deconstructing Seneca Falls and deconstructing the 19th Amendment as the end of the women's movement. But at the K-12 level, we're just trying to get those topics even still covered. And those are still a struggle to get in there. So it's just, it hasn't really caught up with what's happening among scholars at the university level.
Yeah, you mentioned how the research, there's so much more research that's been published recently, and I guess it's changing people's understanding of the narrative. is it also helping to revive and maybe get people more excited about, you know, movements for human rights? Because I found it inspiring. You know, when Estelle, when you were talking about coalitions, you know, it's like, yeah, they all had different things and they found commonalities. And especially now that resonates with me, where everyone is here and there, you know. And actually, I thought that the suffrage movement would make a really, really good mini-series, maybe 2 or 3. You know, there's a lot in there, you know, you could appeal to a lot of different people. So, you know, maybe.
No, I agree with that. And I think all of us feel a certain amount of frustration that this 100th anniversary, I mean, there were so many events planned, so, you know, so many wonderful things, and COVID came along and just kind of, you know, shut it all down. On the other hand, I think that very unfortunately, because of the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been an explosion of interest in the civil rights, in history, in understanding things. And so, I mean, I think that that has been, you know, really sort of inspiring and exciting. But it sure hasn't been the, you know, the year of, you know, of women that I think, you know, a lot of us were anticipating.
Getting towards the end here, it's 8:30.
Okay.
So maybe some closing.
So we have to, it's 8:30, so we're going to close things down. So I'd like each of you to just say what you think about the movement that didn't get across tonight. Because, you know, we were bouncing all over. I was asking all sorts of questions. Is there something you'd like to convey to our audience?
When I talk to my students about it, I try to emphasize that what's inspiring about the movement is that these are women that perceive a problem and are attempting to address it, right? And even though we've talked about all the shortcomings and all their inadequacies in addressing all of the issues, that they are active agents of change in their own time. And that I try to use that, especially with K-12 students, to talk about, you know, how are you an active agent of change? What are you doing to bring about the revolution of sorts in your own life? So I think that that's the one thing that does resonate with the suffragists and progressives in general, right, is that they're all fighting in their own ways for their own issues. And it's really inspiring.
I will say 2 things. One is that social movements tend to need both their moderates and their radicals. The moderates work on the inside as best they can. They try to bore from within. The radicals make them look respectable and bring in new blood and new ideas. And you see that in the early 20th century suffrage movement. You see that in the liberal and radical feminist movements in the 60s and 70s. But the other thing I'd say is, going back to something we talked about from the beginning, I do think that social movements are strongest when they are in alliance and coalition, and that you always have to be careful of that balance of the single issue and not losing sight of who are you excluding by your focus. The focus is important, but so is the broad view. You're muted.
I wanted to add to what Wendy said. I think that looking at you know, the failures, the weaknesses, the problems, and so forth, it really does. I mean, if you show history in just the celebratory way, oh well, women got the vote, isn't this great? They're like, well, I'm not going to try to have some kind of movement because I'm going to screw up and make mistakes. It's just like, no, 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 no. That's what all of these movements are. And they're not perfect. And people do make mistakes, but, you know, but they try, God damn it. You know, that's the thing that I think is really so powerful and to be taken away from. You know, no, they're not, you know, immaculate, you know, know all be all people. They're just people and they make mistakes, but in the end, you know, they try and they do make change.
Did you have a question?
No.
Do you have a question? No. You're okay? And
I think
we're
most of
just
our
getting thank yous. Okay.
and tomorrow we're all supposed to go out and make some change happen, right?
Well, we do have an election year,
Yeah.
and we all have a job to do, not just in voting, but in getting out a fair vote and keeping voting rights alive for those who have them and expanding them for those who deserve them and do not have them. We've got a big job to do.
Big job.
Yeah. Women are very important this year in the election.
Yeah.
Let's hope they all vote.
Well, thank you so much for on behalf of all of us, I think, for this opportunity. This was really a great discussion. We appreciate being part of it.
Lovely to talk with my sister historians and sister AAUW folks.
Yeah, I want to thank you all for participating in this. I was a little, well, definitely a lot intimidated because all of you had a lot more knowledge than I did. I did a lot of web surfing and, I didn't have a lot of knowledge, but sometimes I could tell that Susan B. Anthony was not the same person as some of the other pictures that come up. I don't know how she fits in with Cheryl Tague's. She would come up, her picture would come up sometimes. So, I don't know. So I'm just really happy that you guys came here. And I thought this was a really interesting discussion.
Yeah.
I definitely will read your book. I'll read the book about self-defense because I thought that was great. In fact, I'll read all of your books. I read reviews and
I have to read about Bell.
yeah, I listened to lectures. I listened to Estelle's lecture about the women at Stanford and Nancy, your lectures, and Wendy. I got one lecture that you did where you were talking about women's self-defense. So it's all very, very interesting. I wish I had taken some history classes when I was in college.
It's never too late, Yvonne. Never too late.
Well,
Never
it's just
too
those
late.
13 colonies. I just felt, I just can't go do it anymore,
Thank you all so very, very much, and have a wonderful day tomorrow celebrating the 19th Amendment.
Happy Centennial. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody. Be well.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, I thought you wanted to talk to them. We should have told them to stay on.